So what does the cover-up mean? Let's examine some of these ideas together. The U.S. government controlled the evidence in the JFK assassination, especially the medical evidence, not the mafia, not the Cubans, and not the Soviet Union. The widespread destruction and alteration of evidence therefore implies a U.S. government need to lie about the facts of JFK's death. Now, you can argue about why they would want to lie, but it's clear that the government wanted to and did lie about the facts of JFK's death. LBJ's primary concern in establishing the Warren Commission was not fact-finding, it was rumor control. One of his primary goals was to shut down other investigations, to shut down congressional investigations in the House and Senate, and to shut down a Texas inquest, which he knew was coming. He succeeded in shutting down those other investigations with the Warren Commission. There's a memo that exists today written by a Warren Commission staffer called the Eisenberg Memo. It was written by Melvin Eisenberg. He recorded the statements of Earl Warren made during Earl Warren's first meeting with his staff. Here is a copy on your screen of the Eisenberg Memo. You can see from this memo that LBJ's primary concern was rumor control. He was concerned that others had blamed the assassination on a faction which wanted him in power, and he didn't like that rumor. Chief Justice Warren also mentioned to his staff that LBJ had used the fear of nuclear war to twist Warren's arm and to get him to chair this commission, which Earl Warren did not want to chair. But LBJ trotted out the World War III cover story and used it to instill fear into Warren, and Warren agreed to chair the commission. There's no doubt in my mind that this excuse or this cover story was used by government officials at a high level with many of the mid-level people involved in the cover-up. Most of the mid-level people involved in the cover-up were not guilty of anything sinister. They were following orders, and they probably thought they were doing something patriotic to help their country and to defend against a third world war. The Kennedy family did not believe the official story. They believed there had been a large domestic conspiracy to kill JFK, and they sent a family emissary, artist Bill Walton, to the Soviet Union to so inform the Soviet government. This story about the Kennedy family's beliefs regarding the assassination immediately after the event and about the emissary they sent to the Soviet Union is in the book One Hell of a Gamble, and I highly recommend that anyone interested in this story read this book, which is co-authored by Naftali and Forsenko. The authors accessed KGB files which recorded the content of the meetings between the Kennedy family emissary, Bill Walton, and the KGB agent, Georgy Bolshakov, in Moscow. So I believe this is an accurate source for what the Kennedy family representative told the Russians at the time, and what they told them was, we don't hold you responsible for the assassination. We don't think you had anything to do with it. We believe it was a large domestic conspiracy. Most people I know don't study the assassination because they think it's a parlor game or something fun to do. They study it because they want to understand whether or not their government told them the truth. They want to understand what exactly happened in 1963. So why was JFK killed? At the height of America's Cold War with the Soviet Union, President Kennedy was pursuing foreign policy objectives that were anathema to the national security establishment. Namely, he turned down recommendations to invade Cuba on 3 occasions, once in 1961 and twice in 1962. Let me elaborate on that. In 1961, when the Bay of Pigs invasion, the exile invasion, sponsored by the CIA, approved by Kennedy, failed, and failed immediately, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA pressured President Kennedy to intervene militarily and to save the invasion. He refused because he had warned the other federal agencies before the Bay of Pigs was launched that under no circumstances would U.S. forces be involved. He was willing to help freedom fighters recapture their homeland. He was not willing to involve the U.S. military in an aggressive war in this hemisphere against a Latin American neighbor. So he decided he would rather take one on the chin and admit some embarrassment to the United States that its exile invasion that it had sponsored had failed, rather than be a liar. So he chose not to be a liar and to stick by his guns. An interview with Allen Dulles many years later, former director of the CIA, revealed that Dulles believed at the time of the Bay of Pigs that the president would do whatever was required to save the operation, no matter how the operation unfolded. Daniel Shore, former CBS newsman, expressed his opinion on NPR radio a few years ago that President Kennedy was the victim of a covert operation in the Bay of Pigs, in which many of the people who launched the exile invasion knew it was likely to fail and didn't care, and thought that it would suck the president in and force him to commit U.S. military resources to retaking Cuba. That's an opinion I concur with. There were two other occasions when President Kennedy opted not to invade Cuba. One was in the spring of 1962. And actually, in the spring of '62, he refused twice, or rather his administration did. The first refusal was when he rejected Operation Northwoods. Now, Operation Northwoods, these pretexts for invasion, died at some level. We don't know whether it died at the SecDef's desk, at Secretary McNamara's desk, or at the White House, but it died. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyman Lemnitzer, who had a very rocky and very contentious relationship with President Kennedy, brought up the subject again at a meeting in March. And the president summarily dismissed the idea of unilateral U.S. military invasion or U.S. pretexts for starting a war. He summarily rejected this attempt by Lemnitzer to resurrect the Northwoods idea. And a month later, on April 10th of 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent a blistering memo to the Secretary of Defense. This memo, dated April 10th, '62, was a lecture, a scolding, and a tutorial to Robert S. McNamara, telling him that the existence of a communist regime in Cuba was incompatible with the security requirements of the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere, that we had to invade with U.S. forces immediately, that we should do it right away before we let the reserves go home. They also said that they thought we could invade Cuba without the risk of general war. General war was the code name in those days for a worldwide nuclear conflict. So they thought we could do it and get away with it without the risk of general war. And they demanded that it be done in the near future. We don't know what McNamara's response was, but it didn't happen. So that's really two occasions, back to back, in the spring of '62, where Kennedy refused to invade. President Kennedy's final refusal to invade Cuba occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was the one act that I think the national security establishment never forgave him for. The consensus during the missile crisis was that the United States should bomb the hell out of Cuba and follow with a U.S. military invasion to make sure once and for all that the Castro regime was taken down and that all the missiles were removed. President Kennedy instructed the military to prepare for invasion and did so in full sight of the world. And indeed, that was one of the strategies that worked in our favor, is that our adversaries knew that we were preparing to do so if necessary. So they took the threat of invasion seriously. Once the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved through diplomacy instead of through invasion, President Kennedy had a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to thank them for their assistance and advice during the crisis. The meeting was not anything like he had hoped it would be. It was acrimonious and contentious, and General LeMay in particular as well as Admiral Anderson, the head of the Navy, expressed extreme displeasure, told the president we lost, we should wipe them out, we should invade today and wipe them out, we've lost, it's the biggest defeat in our history, etc., etc., etc. Admiral Anderson said we've been had. It was General LeMay that said it's the biggest defeat in our history, we should wipe them out today. I don't think these people ever forgave the president for refusing to invade Cuba during the missile crisis. And I think that more than any other factor, this acrimony was the proximate cause of the beginning of the assassination plot. Many things occurred during 1963 in which President Kennedy was rapidly changing the course of American foreign policy at the height of the Cold War. All of these things upset the same group of people, the people that ran the CIA and the people in the Pentagon. But that was just adding insult to injury. The main injury in their eyes was failure to invade Cuba. Cuba was the obsession of the national security establishment from 1959 on. And I think it was the proximate cause of the assassination plot, President Kennedy's decision not to invade. Of course, I'm one of the people that's extremely grateful today that he did not do so. There's one more reason that President Kennedy's Cuba policy was completely unacceptable to the national security establishment, and by this I mean the Pentagon and the CIA. President Kennedy, we now know, was engaged in secret negotiations, or I should say negotiations that he thought were secret, to develop better relations with Castro's Cuba. So instead of invading Cuba and removing the Castro regime, which is what the national security establishment wanted him to do, President Kennedy was attempting to establish communication channels with Castro through his secret emissary, Ambassador Bill Atwood, late in 1963. And Ambassador Atwood was using a journalist, a reporter named Lisa Howard. They were both making phone calls, and Lisa Howard's phone calls in particular were being monitored by the NSA and being intercepted. So this attempt at rapprochement with Castro's Cuba, in which the message was going to be, we can live with your government and we can normalize relations, providing you cut your ties with the Soviet Union. You kick out the Russian advisors and you sever your economic ties with the Soviet Union, all of our good relations can be restored and you have no reason to fear the United States. That was the policy toward which Kennedy was moving. He made that policy clear to a French journalist, Jean Daniel. Daniel delivered the message to Fidel Castro that Kennedy had some sympathy with the Cuban Revolution, that all things could be restored to normal relations if the right conditions were met, and on that very day, President Kennedy was assassinated. So knowledge of this secret attempt at a rapprochement with Cuba by the national security establishment certainly didn't help Kennedy's cause, and they were surely aware of it in September and October and November of 1963. So this has to be added to another one of the reasons why President Kennedy was killed. History tells us today what we didn't know in 1963. The Soviet Union not only shipped and set up 36 medium-range ballistic missiles with 1 megaton nuclear warheads on Cuba in an attempt to prevent a U.S. invasion and to equalize the nuclear imbalance, in which they were at a great disadvantage at the time. But they also shipped to Cuba, to protect the medium-range nuclear missiles, 102 battlefield nuclear weapons. Now, about 4 of these were nuclear mines for use underwater. I think 6 were nuclear bombs that could have been delivered by the IL-28 medium bombers. But the majority of these were missiles that would have been fired at invasion ships or invasion beaches in the event of a U.S. invasion. 12 of the battlefield nukes were Luna missiles, which had very small nuclear warheads, which nevertheless could have destroyed ships and killed a lot of soldiers on the beach. There were 80 so-called FKR cruise missiles, which were like miniature, unpiloted drone MiG aircraft, with Hiroshima-size nuclear warheads inside, which could have destroyed a city or a naval base like Guantanamo. In fact, that was the plan. During the missile crisis, unknown to us at the time, one of the Soviet commanders had moved 3 FKR missile batteries close to Guantanamo Bay. This was revealed in the book by Michael Dobbs called 8 Minutes to Midnight. He was intending to fire those in the event of a U.S. invasion. There's no bones about it. Guantanamo Bay would have been destroyed by nuclear fire, and the nuclear escalation would have begun, worldwide probably. When the battlefield nukes were introduced into Cuba, the rules of engagement at that time were that the local commanders had permission to fire the battlefield nuclear weapons in the event of a U.S. invasion and in the event they could not contact Moscow. I want to repeat that. The local commanders had permission to use the nuclear weapons on their own, the battlefield nukes, in the event the U.S. invaded Cuba. On the day that President Kennedy made his missile crisis speech on October 22nd, 1962, at that time, an alarmed Premier Khrushchev in the Soviet Union rescinded the authority for the local commanders in Cuba to use the battlefield nukes. But the fact remains that many of these Soviet military people who were in Cuba at the time have been interviewed subsequently, and they have said in no uncertain terms that if there had been an invasion, they would have used the weapons. They were not going to ignominiously surrender to the Americans and raise their hands. They would have used the weapons on the American invaders, and quite frankly, World War III would have begun, because then the American president would have had no choice but to retaliate with nuclear fire somewhere else in the world against the Soviet Union. And that would have quickly escalated into World War III. So I'm very grateful, as I said, that President Kennedy did not invade, because it would have resulted in a catastrophe. The CIA knew nothing about the battlefield nuclear warheads that were on Cuba. They knew nothing about the 102 battlefield nukes. The CIA had only discovered one type of cruise missile prior to the end of the missile crisis, and that was near the very end of the crisis on Thursday, October 25th. The CIA discovered in photography that there were some Frog missiles on the island. They didn't know whether the Frogs had nuclear warheads or not. It's unclear what the CIA told President Kennedy about the Frogs. We still don't know. That information is still classified. But the planning throughout the entire missile crisis was made on the assumption that we could invade with near impunity, with the knowledge that the Soviets wouldn't be able to seriously oppose us. So those assumptions were wrong on 2 counts. We did not know about the battlefield nukes, and the United States seriously underestimated the number of Soviet troops on the island, and only later realized that the forces were much more robust and much larger than they had suspected at the time. And when the Americans began to learn, American historians and prior officials, former officials such as Secretary McNamara, began to learn in 1992 and 3 that the Soviets had battlefield nukes in Cuba, they were absolutely terrified, petrified. McNamara, in particular, became quite emotional on national television in a Larry King interview, and was horrified at what would have ensued, because he knew how close we were to invasion. So I'm very grateful that we didn't invade. But of course, at the time, the Pentagon and the CIA were very resentful that President Kennedy chose not to invade Cuba during the missile crisis. The Vietnam withdrawal orders were cemented without any doubt by Robert McNamara at the May 1963 SecDef conference in Hawaii. We now know that. NSAM 263, National Security Action Memo 263, was issued on October 11th, 1963, codifying and formalizing that withdrawal. McNamara discussed it at length during the SecDef conference in May '63 in Hawaii, but it was made a presidential order by NSAM 263 in October of 1963, and that NSAM also specified in the fine print, as it were, that all U.S. forces were to be withdrawn from Vietnam by the end of 1965. So the order in NSAM 263 was to pull out 1,000 men by the end of the year and to remove all U.S. forces by the end of 1965. That is a fact. It's no longer a subject of debate. Another reason why I believe JFK was killed was that he was working very hard to end the Cold War and to pursue peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. President Kennedy's most important speech, in my view, was the so-called peace speech at American University in June of 1963. President Kennedy's peace speech was a great act of courage to propose ending the Cold War and proving that you were serious about it by signing a nuclear test ban treaty with your adversary, the Soviet Union. But that's what he did. He not only advocated acceleration of efforts to sign a nuclear test ban treaty, he also began to talk about disarmament in that speech. So the peace speech at American University on June 10th, 1963, to use a graphic metaphor, was probably the final nail in Kennedy's coffin. If there was anyone in the national security establishment at a high level that was wavering or unsure about the assassination plot at that time, I'm sure that that made up their minds for them. President Kennedy was pursuing widespread changes to American foreign policy, which would have become permanent in his second term if he had been reelected. His reelection seemed imminent and unstoppable to all insiders, to everyone in the know. Everyone knew he would be facing Barry Goldwater from the Republican Party. Everybody knew that he could beat the pants off Goldwater in an election because Kennedy would present himself successfully and truthfully as a moderate and as a change agent, and Goldwater would present himself as a warmonger and a hawk, which of course is exactly what Goldwater did in 1964 against Lyndon Johnson, and he lost that election badly. Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide, partly because of Kennedy's legacy and Kennedy's memory, and partly because of fear of Barry Goldwater by the American people. Now, the peace speech at American University, as eloquent as it was just the tip of the iceberg. President Kennedy, early in his term, had begun exchanging secret correspondence with Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. The men were from very different cultures and very different personal backgrounds, and they needed this tool to help them better understand each other and to get to trust each other. After the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both men were shaken and horrified at how close we had come to general war, as the Pentagon called it. So their secret correspondence accelerated following the missile crisis and continued throughout 1963 along the same themes present in the peace speech. So there was a serious man-to-man negotiation underway, mano a mano, between Jack Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev through secret letters during the end of 1962 and throughout 1963 about ways to end the Cold War. So the most visible aspect of this effort on their part to end the Cold War and to de-escalate tensions was the successful implementation of a limited nuclear test ban treaty in the summer of 1963. And not only did Kennedy sign a treaty with the Soviets, not only did his representatives sign the treaty in Moscow, but he successfully shepherded this treaty through the Senate and ended up signing the instruments of ratification in October of 1963. It was his proudest achievement. But there were going to be other things to come. So this secret correspondence was concerned with things like disarmament, the natural follow-on to any nuclear test ban treaty. if an arms control agreement of any kind had been consummated in Jack Kennedy's second term, that was going to be the reason to justify the American president's visit to Moscow for the first time. Jack Kennedy confirmed to close associates like Bill Walton, who was the family's emissary later after his assassination. He confirmed to close associates that he did intend to visit Moscow. He was hopeful that he could do that in his second term. And signing a nuclear arms agreement of some kind would have been the perfect capstone and justification for that visit. So this secret correspondence, unfortunately, was not totally secret. Some letters were completely private between President Kennedy and Khrushchev, and some of the letters were routed through the State Department before they went out and for comment afterwards. So this effort wasn't totally secret, and it cannot have made anyone in the national security establishment happy at the time. In addition to the peace speech and its proposal that we sign a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, President Kennedy was proposing ending his most popular program with the American people. He was proposing ending the Apollo program to land on the moon. Now, the unstated and unspoken goal of Kennedy's space program and the Apollo program was to beat the Soviet Union to the moon, to finally gain the upper ground, the high ground in the space race. So Jack Kennedy and his advisors in 1961, in a state of depression and near panic after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, had selected the moon as the best goal to select in which we could definitely beat the Soviet Union in space. At the time, we were number 2 and they were number 1. And at the time, number 2 was last. The program was very popular with the Congress. It was very popular with big business, with the aerospace industry, and very popular with the American people. Everyone felt in their gut, everyone felt viscerally that this was our chance to embarrass the Soviets and to get our pride back and to beat them to the moon. Everybody was behind this program. Jack Kennedy, the initiator of the moon landing goal, was the one person in government who was having second thoughts. He gave a speech to the United Nations in September of 1963 in which he proposed going to the moon jointly with the Soviet Union instead of separately. He said, why should nations race when they can work together? To him, it was the best way to demonstrate a new détente with the Soviet Union, a new cooperation, the best way to demonstrate peaceful coexistence, and the best way to stop demonizing the Russians, to work with them in a joint project in space. He proposed this in the United Nations in September of '63. The reaction within the American defense establishment and national security establishment must have been abject horror. I mean, truly. Initially, he did not receive any response from Khrushchev because Khrushchev was a little paranoid and he was afraid that the Americans would try to steal Soviet technology, which ended up being a joke because they never did make it to the moon and we landed 6 times successfully. President Kennedy indicated how serious he was about this goal of a joint lunar landing by sending a national security action to the head of NASA, James Webb, in November of 1963. In the month of his death, he sent a presidential order, which he called a national security order, which he personally signed to James Webb, ordering Mr. Webb to begin these cooperative efforts with the Soviets of going to the moon together, and he wanted reports by mid-December. President Kennedy did not even sign the Vietnam withdrawal order. His national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, signed in SAM 263, but President Kennedy signed the directive to James Webb. He was serious about détente with the Soviet Union. He was serious about ending the Cold War, and landing on the moon together, even if it had taken longer than we wanted it to take, would have been the ultimate symbol of the end of the Cold War, of détente, and of peaceful coexistence. As we all know, President Kennedy was assassinated, and that never happened. But it would have been a truly symbolic moment for men of both nations to step out of the same spacecraft and plant the flags of their two countries in the lunar regolith. Those interested in an American empire and a Pax Americana based on military might, in short, a cabal of powerful, like-minded individuals within the military, intelligence, industrial complex, decided this was unacceptable and cast a secret veto on JFK's life. Now, the assassination was clearly carried out in such a way that it could be blamed on America's two arch-enemies at the time, the USSR and Cuba. The patsy, the falsely accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, had previously defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, likely as part of an intelligence operation, and had later engaged in a charade in 1963 in which he pretended to be a supporter of Fidel Castro's communist Cuba. His visit to Mexico City in September of 1963 was carefully engineered to implicate both the Soviet and Cuban governments in the assassination. Now, blaming the assassination on America's two principal enemies had two effects. First of all, it killed any hope of détente with the Soviet bloc, and was probably designed to provoke an invasion of Cuba. And second, LBJ and Hoover's FBI cynically used the pervasive fear of World War III as an internal excuse for a massive cover-up of the facts and evidence surrounding the assassination. The legacy of the JFK assassination 50 years later is not a pleasant one to contemplate. The Cold War between the U.S. and USSR ended one generation later than it could have, resulting in many billions of dollars in rubles spent on an escalating nuclear arms race. Countless lives, American and Asian, were wasted in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in a needless war in Southeast Asia that should not have been pursued. JFK understood this before his death, and this is why he was withdrawing the American advisors from Vietnam before a hot war could start, before the advisors were turned into combat troops. At the time President Kennedy was assassinated, less than 100 Americans had been killed in Vietnam. The slow, gradual exposure of the cover-up has been the primary cause of the corrosive loss of faith in the U.S. government. Most people no longer trust the government. We, the American people, cannot regain our self-respect or our former trust in government until and unless the U.S. government acknowledges that JFK's murder was an inside job, a domestic coup, and admits that individuals within the federal government covered up the crime during the 1960s and 1970s. For those who wish to learn more about the medical cover-up and the alteration of the Zapruder film, I recommend this book, the book that I wrote. Or you can visit my blog site. Now, this is the address of my blog site, inside the arrb.livejournal.com. There are several products available to you via that blog site. One is a link to 7 in-depth essays that I've written for the Future of Freedom Foundation called JFK's War with the National Security Establishment. A link to Mr. Hornberger's site is available on my blog page, and that will lead you to the 7 essays. Links to 2 extended video interviews are available on my blog site. One is about the medical cover-up, and as previously mentioned, the other video interview is about the alteration of the Zapruder film and features Dino Brugioni. There are links to other important essays available on my blog site, one about the 2 Zapruder film events at the NPIC in Washington, and another one about how JFK's body was transported to Bethesda Naval Hospital 20 minutes prior to the arrival of the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade. This second essay focuses on the important content in the Air Force One audio tapes. I'd like to conclude this presentation with an important quote. President Kennedy said in 1962, in an address supporting the Voice of America radio program, "We seek a free flow of information. We are not afraid to entrust the American people with unpleasant facts, for a nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its people." significant words. And the government today refuses to admit that there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy, refuses to admit that there was a cover-up, and attempts to hide its head in the sand while sponsoring third-party surrogates who bombard us with propaganda every November in the mainstream media. This is a shameful state of affairs. America could do better than this. All the American people want is the truth. We don't like to be lied to, and we want to understand our true history. We don't want to live in a world of myth and fantasy. The American people can handle the truth. Thank you.